Okay, so there's two titles here: navigating through the world of polycrisis, which is sort of the overall view what also Lida introduced, and in that we're going to specifically look at basically how the spiritual or wellness environment got married to alt-right in the last years. And specifically, we're going to look at what are some of these pitfalls of the green value systems, and that's where I'll talk a lot also about the environments I've been in and I've been part of myself and things that I've experienced myself and in the last 20 years. But before we do that, I think it's good to look at the wider context of what we're talking about. At the moment, the world is going through what we call polycrisis, right? So we have multiple crises layered on top of each other. We see, from a spiral dynamics point of view, we can see that we are invited to start thinking very differently about life on this planet in order to survive, basically, to think in a what we call in spiral dynamics yellow, in a global way, and to see the connection between things, to realize that we can't live a disconnected life from the rest of the world anymore, right? And so in all these crises, they're connecting countries and they're connecting the globe. The climate is something we have to solve with the whole globe. The refugees, viruses. We see we see the tension between nations happening, between democracy and autocracy. We see growing wealth gaps especially in Western countries at the moment. Energy crisis. So all of this, all of these are layered on top of each other. And I think that as we sit here, most of us will feel that in our systems, right? We will feel it in our nervous systems. We will be aware of these crises in ourselves. Some of us may be more affected by it than others. But I think all of us will actually feel the dissonance, feel that something is happening in this world, that there is you could say there's a big discomfort happening in the world, and we sensed it. So if we then look at what's happening on a geopolitical layer from a spiral dynamics lens, we see that the power base in the world is centered around red, blue, and orange values. Some countries are more driven by red values. A lot of countries are sort of governed from a blue values perspective. Western countries, there's a lot of orange in that as well. In some countries, we see some green in politics, in Northern Europe, in Canada, of course, in the US, it's also a bit, Australia, New Zealand, but it's not that widely available, right? One of the things that's happening in Western countries is that neoliberalism is cutting away, you could say, the structures, right? It's an idea about a free market, about you could say an economic freedom that knows no boundaries, in depleting the planet, that knows no boundaries in increasing the wealth gap, and so that's been going on for a number of years, and we more and more see that actually has created a lot of these crises, right? And we see that orange is a dominant system at least in the Western world, but we also see that it's actually in decline. Its way of thinking is no longer capable of governing this planet. It may be able to govern a company or a country, but it doesn't address these crises. The way of thinking from orange, and it's not because orange is inherently bad. It's just that the way of thinking is based on infinite growth, is based on infinite resources being available, and this orange actually has been so successful that we are finding out that it doesn't work anymore, and it can't solve the problems that we're facing, these crises. And another dynamic we see is that because orange is cutting away a lot of the blue structures, or the neoliberalism is cutting away a lot of the blue structures, the greed from red values, where everything is just about me, is getting a lot of space, right? Within Western countries, but around the globe, around the world, right? If you look at the Russian oligarchs, right, when the Soviet Union collapsed and it opened up as a free market, then you see that both Western and Russian greed created the oligarchs and created a very a system that basically took all the wealth of the Soviet Union into the hands of a few people there. So this is the situation in the world, and I think as we sit here, most of us understand that, right? And we can see that, and I think a lot of people in the Western world actually see this, right? And it means that, if you look at what I call the systems dynamics of that, we see that this blue power base that we have in the West is being attacked by two sides. It is being attacked by you could say purple-red forces, and I'm talking about the upcoming alt-right movement around the world. So I'm talking about the Trumps in America, in Italy we've seen a move to the right. In Sweden, actually, we've seen that. The Netherlands, we see that we see a number of political parties that are on the far right and that are, you could say, extremely violently attacking the sitting government, and there's no trust, like there's zero trust in the sitting government, right? But at the same time, we see that those people that have progressed out of these orange and blue values, and that have entered sort of the green way of thinking a lot more egalitarian around the world, they're also attacking the power base. They also have no trust, and I think as we sit here, I think very few will have trust in our current governments. At least I can't judge for all of you in all your different countries, but in the Netherlands, in I don't know how that's in Switzerland actually at the moment, but there's very little trust. I know in the Netherlands there is very little trust in the current government, and so we see that there's actually real problems out there, and from the purple red, it's attacked because everything is too progressive. And from the green values, it's attacked because it sees all these problems that orange has created, and it actually blames orange for it. And it would like to, from a green perspective, we may want to cut out orange. We'll talk about that. Another thing to realize when we look at this geopolitical situation is that there are open democracies in the world that are you say the blue, orange, green democracies. They're very open. We have the internet, and we've seen how the Russians have played a role in Brexit, in the election of Trump. We don't know if those events would have happened without their influence, but we can see that it's very easy for forces outside a country to actually influence those countries strongly. And I think that a lot of the things that we're seeing around you say right-wing opinion is stimulated by forces outside the countries where it's happening. At the same time, we see that the more authoritarian regimes like Russia, they're very closed off. Inside they may be based a lot on purple and red values, dictatorship and so on. But they also have the capacity to put large restrictions on media and so on. The media in the Western world has problems. Obviously, with social media, we're struggling with how do we deal with that? How do we deal with misinformation? But we have to realize that in part of the world, the information flow to the people is very strictly controlled, like in a country like Russia. Okay, so now let's start to zoom in on how, from green values, we actually respond to all this, right? And so there's a healthy way that green responds to situations, and then you will see that as a context, I'm going to use a lot of examples out of the COVID situation, and I'm going to use a lot of examples out of what's happening around Ukraine at the moment, because those are situations that bring us to a point of choice, where we really have to, how are we relating to that? And it forces us, especially because our environment is so polarized, it forces us to make a choice there. And to be very clear, I'm talking from a position here where I don't believe the COVID virus is created or specifically by a small group of people. I'm talking from a perspective here where the world has been how to say, surprised, or the COVID crisis happens to the world, and what I've seen around the world is people struggling how to respond to that. I don't think there was a central control there. I wish it would have been, because it would have been maybe a lot better. So talking from that perspective, we see that green values, the positive thing of that is that it creates harmony. It creates a civil society. So it creates a society in which human life is valued, in which human suffering is minimized, in which human diversity is welcomed and as broadly as possible. Right? Remember that from a green value system, we can actually connect to not just to our own country or to our own tribe, but we can connect to all people outside that. So we have a lot of capacity for empathy there. And we see a lot of people, sacrifice self for the greater good, right? I mentioned addressing humanitarian issues. There is a space again for feelings and emotions that are valued. If we look at for instance, the COVID situation, a lot of the care in hospitals, especially from the nurses' side of things, is done from green values. People actually went in there and risked their own health, in some situations their own life, to care for people. We saw in many countries that people started to help each other in lockdowns and so on. So we've seen a lot of positive response from that. I'm not saying it's only people driven by green values that does that, but that's a healthy expression of those green values. So if green is healthy, it transcends orange, but it also includes it. So it takes you could say, the positive sides of it. It believes in the science of orange. It may be critical about some of the science, but it still sees science as a valuable contribution that orange makes to the world. Rationale, data, and so on. Right? That's a healthy expression, and it doesn't mean that healthy green values aren't critical about a lot of these things that are happening, right? But we'll see them in perspective. Now, what we've seen especially in the last year, since the start of the COVID crisis, but what was actually happening before that already, is that there has also been quite an unhealthy response from part of people driven by green values. Right? We've seen anti-authoritarian responses, sectarian. We'll talk about all these things today: sectarian dynamics, narcissism, feelings of emotions guiding the people, pacifism. Anyway, we'll go through all these items, and when I do that, I want to emphasize that what I'm talking about is are memes of culture that are in our society and that run through us. And some of these memes may be close to me as an individual, and I may be very heavily affected by it, and other memes may be further away. Right? And it also means that all these aspects I'm talking about in various people, they are present in various degrees. Right? Some of these things I recognize in myself. Some of them you recognize in yourself, and I really like to invite you to listen in a non-personal way about this. because if I look back at what I've done in the last 25 years in the new, in what I would call the self-development world or the new age world or the spiritual world, there's things I would never ever do again, right? But at that time, I was convinced that it was the right thing to do. And some of these memes I'm talking about, they've run through me, right? And they've run through my system and so on. So so please be aware of that, you know, when we go through this. So one of the first things I want to address is that what we've seen happening is that from a green perspective, especially around the COVID times, freedom became an important theme, right? And with that, we've seen a strong response against any form of authority. So we've seen that there's been a strong response from people against, you know, having to wear masks. And of course, in different countries, it's been quite different. You know, in some, if you look to what happened in China, that is unimaginable for the most European countries, right? The strictness of the rules and regulations there were extreme. In Europe, we've seen very different responses between different countries. But in quite a few countries, and I'm talking about the Netherlands and Germany, the US, we've seen strong response from people saying, we want our freedom back. We don't want to be vaccinated. We don't want to have vaccinations. We don't want to have a pass and so on. Nobody tells me what to do. And you see that if that idea is, I mean, of course, it's healthy that citizens are critical about the authority in a country. But what we've also seen happening in these times is that this idea of personal freedom was struggling with social responsibility, right? And it also became so polarized that everything the governments were doing was seen as bad. And it's up to today, it's actually leading to the fact that, you know, people, when I go extremely into this thinking, I don't accept anything anymore from my government. And so my government is bad because of whatever COVID situation. Now my government is supporting Ukraine, so Ukraine must be bad. That sort of line of thinking we see. And I've put here the icons from both green and red thinking. So you see that you know, this sort of green thinking has developed from people who you know, see the world as a jungle from a red value system and think, you know, I have to take care of myself to survive. But we've also seen it happen from people that are attached to green values about, you know, egalitarian thinking and so on. And I don't think those people with green values have all of a sudden, you know, resorted to red values. I think they're actually from the green values. I think it's a sign of strong rejection of orange, to the point where you can compare it to the hippies. You know, the hippies had a strong rejection of authority, blue orange structures, and I think the same has happened in part of the people driven from green values. And the interesting thing about that is if you look at the definition of freedom, you know, there's a definition of freedom that is about creating a democratic society that is, you know, freedom from suppression, and but a freedom that has a social aspect. You know, so it's the freedom to be who you are in your society. So that definition of freedom, which you could say is a more social definition of freedom, is not what we've seen expressed here. This is a definition of freedom that is more conservative. It's like I want to be able to do what I do, and you know, fuck the rest, basically. You know, so it's my freedom. And I've actually had, you know, I was part of a community that were you know, people exploring spirituality when the COVID crisis started, and I've had a lot of conversations with people in there because most of those people actually went into this idea of freedom. And I had people literally say to me, I don't care about anything. It's about my freedom. You know, I need to do what I do. I don't care about these other people. So with that, what we see happening is that in many of the self-development, yoga world, spiritual world, we've seen that people are organized in groups. I was in this group that I just talked about, and actually around Isaac Shapiro, and there's been there's different spiritual leaders or people that have been out there that form group. But you find it in all sorts of, it's not necessarily around or just around spirituality. And what you see happening in there is that that group actually creates safety, right? And that group also often have its own way of dealing, looking at the world, dealing with things, its own truth, its methodology, its own ways of you could say self-development, self-explorations, and so on. Some of them are led by a strong leader, and one of the typical things in that is around these development groups is that people tend to see themselves as being more developed than others, and we actually have the same thing in this power dynamics community, right? Because we talk about this model. I think most of people think of themselves as being yellow, and in that way, although we may say 100 times that it's not about being better or worse, still we think that we see ourselves as being more developed than others. Right? I've been part of a community here in the Netherlands where we actually called it the new community. Sort of was the ambition of creating a new world, and we thought arrogantly that we together could create a better world than was out there. The thing that really has, I knew about this in a few years ago when COVID started, and I'd been out of communities because of those dynamics. I didn't realize I was in such a community again. And the thing that really struck me is that where I saw around me, my neighbors, a lot of people in my town, responding to the COVID crisis in a way where they started to help people within our community, that wasn't happening. People were taking care of themselves, but of nobody else. There was very little care to the outside world. And the conspiracy theories are starting to flourish. And COVID wasn't happening at first. People didn't believe that people were ill at all. And it was, and what you see happening in such a group is that and also that it is connected, of course, with algorithms on the internet that select the type of information that we click on and that we like most. You see that more and more the group gets focused into one direction, one way of thinking. We were there, and some of us were critical about because the guy that was running the group I was in, the guy that was leading it, started to share a lot of information that came from right-wing websites. We were pointing out that was the case, and there was really nobody cared about that. And any criticism we had was seen as an attack on the group. So after a while, being in that group and saying, listen, guys, what's going on here, that information isn't right. We weren't attacking anybody. We're just saying, look, that information isn't right, and what you write here, that's not. If you look there, you can find other facts. And this information comes from right-wing websites. Please don't share it. After a while, we were the ones that were attacking the harmony in the group. And we got very aggressively addressed by everybody, right? And these were people, we were doing these spiritual retreats like love, and it was all about, it was quite shocking to see that. Right? And the typical thing what happens in a group like that is if you give a dissident noise, the group has a method to deal with that. And it's like you have to look at your own shadows. Our nervous systems were triggered. That's why that's what the language in the group was that I was part of. I've been part of another community where you had to be coached. If you had there was a strong leader there. If anybody criticized a leader, they needed to be coached because they didn't see things very clearly. And that's what you see happening in these groups. And that's how they can create extreme tunnel vision, because any critical voice is any critical voice will strengthen their belief in their own system. Right? The story they have as a sect is such that that any critique is proof of their being right, because look, that's outside that the group, and people so they're building a protection against criticism, right? And in different groups it may be different things, if you the point I want to make here is, you see some groups out there that are very sectarian, clearly from the outside. But what the last years has shown us, that many of these groups that don't look so sectarian are actually quite sectarian. They have all these dynamics in them. And of course, I mean, this may even go outside, you could say corners of the internet could be one of those sectarian groups as well, right? But this is a very important part of this whole dynamic. Now, another, so the connection here with green values, of course, is that from green values, we're interested in all this self-development stuff. So that's how we end up in these groups, right? There's purple connections there as well. It's often because as people, we are in this development process, we may feel vulnerable, and then this group gives us a lot of safety to be in and to go through that process. But the other thing that we see in there is that part of this green value system and that has gone strongly into self-development has developed an extreme narcissism. And I don't know what came first. I don't know if the processes that we did creates narcissism, or if it attracts people that have a narcissistic tendency. And I don't use that word lightly, but it's like the way it relates to green values is that from green values, I seek harmony. And at some stage, that search of harmony, especially when the world becomes so uncertain as it is currently, and we start to feel all this dissonance, our need for harmony may be so big that it becomes like a personal quest. It's no longer creating a society that's harmonious, but just making sure that I'm in harmony. And basically, I don't care about the rest. I'll give you an example of that. We used to run these large spiral dynamics training groups. And in one of them, we would put like 150 people in a circle with money in the middle. And we tell them, that real money, like 500 euros or 1,000 euros. And we tell them, we want you to reach consensus on which good cause to spend that 1,000 euros on. It was a game, but it was real money that would go to a real cause. In one of those games, people started to burn the money. It became such a chaos. Everybody, they didn't manage, and it became a total chaos. And in there, 2 people went to the money and they started to burn it. We managed to stop the game and save the money. And then we asked them, tell us, what really drove you to that? This isn't a personal thing. It's this game dynamic that happened. And this one woman said, listen, I couldn't stand the chaos anymore. I thought if the money is gone, then at least we as a group are back to harmony. And that is part of the pitfalls of the green system, that we want harmony so badly that we are willing to sacrifice a good cause for that. And then that narcissism becomes the fact that we see that back in a lot of the responses to these crises, where my needs become more important than the needs of others. And it can even lead to thinking that we are some sort of superhuman beings, right? So because if you look in that culture of self-development and health and so on, you get the impression that you can actually control your own health as long as you eat healthy, and that we actually have control over that. I'm not saying it's bad to eat healthy. I'm just saying that the idea that we can completely control our health is a bit disillusional, right? The healthiest people can get the worst illnesses and so on. You know, of course, statistically, we may have some influence on that. But in the COVID crisis, we see that it leads to people believing that I don't need any help because my immune system can actually deal very well with COVID because I've boosted it. Now, I don't want to go into the truths of the untruths of that, but if you really, if you really look into that and you talk to immunologists and people that really know about that, that's not really how the immune system works, right? But I've seen people, I've had people in my friends group that said, we don't need vaccines. Look, we had COVID and we went through it, and so if they didn't say, oh, lucky we didn't get really ill and didn't have to go to the hospital. No, they said it was because of my good immune system, and as to me, that's part of this green narcissism, because we can't really know if that's true, right? And we can't really, and we see very healthy people get very ill from COVID. So there is a lot of data to support that may not necessarily be the case, right? And what we see in this part of the meme is, rather than see ourselves as being a speck in the, or in a cosmos and a little piece of dust in the whole cosmos, I think a lot of the stuff that we've done in self-development in a green meme has led to putting ourselves into the center of the universe and thinking that we are the center of the cosmos, basically. And that then again is connected to the fact that, when we really dive into these green values and we are revaluing our feelings, our emotions, and things like that, we get to the point where the feelings are guiding us rather than the facts and the figures in this world, right? And I'm not saying it's bad to have attention on our feelings and emotions and so on. Of course, that's important, right? But if we go extreme into that, we start to reject orange data, the science. We don't believe anything anymore that we see in the media, and then there's this concept that we have in a lot of these, self-development and spiritual worlds, is that, well, my intuition is guiding my life. The question I always ask myself, is it in my intuition or is it just how I feel? Right? We don't really know, right? And at some stage, there's nothing against following your heart, right? But when you have a medical illness, before you follow your heart, it may be good to get advice from a specialist that really knows what's going on in your system, right? And that's the rationale that in part of the green value system has been lost, right? And around COVID we saw that, around health and things, but we still see that. We see it also a lot around many other topics, especially on what information people believe that they see on the internet. And we see that it's at some stage how I feel when I see that video is more important than checking factually whether that video was true or not. Right? And this community I was part of, the leader was posting all these videos, and I told him, listen, please check your facts, right? Because this is what you're posting here, it's not true. There you can see it's not true. And at some stage he responded, he said, I can't check all my sources, and I trust them because they feel okay. Now that is the sort of pitfall we can fall into, right? And then I've named two names here. Zach Bush is somebody that talks in a way that is very attractive to those people that value emotions and feelings, right? If you look at the facts that he presents, there's a lot of things wrong with that. But because of the way he talks, and Russell Brunson is another one, it's a very different energy that he has. But those are people that are trusted a lot by those in the self-development, spiritual world, etc. Right? Because they use our language, they appeal to us. But at some stage, we have to see, well, is that really true what they're saying? Right? And charisma, if I'm in this meme, charisma is more important than anything. And of course, it also applies to people outside the green meme. If you look at what's happening around Trump, there's a similar dynamic there, right? But it comes from a different value system. It comes from a different way of looking at the world, you could say. So it comes from a perspective where, from a purple, red, blue value base, orange science is not so much in my worldview. Whereas we're talking here about people driven by green values who actually somehow have gone through orange development and have started to reject it again. It's a different dynamic. And I've seen it, people that didn't believe any of the science, but they found an article by their guru on ivermectin for COVID. So they didn't believe the science of the vaccinations, but they believed that one article, and because their guru posted it, that's what they took when they got COVID, for instance. Yeah. Another dynamic we see here is all opinions matter, right? So one of the qualities of the green value system is that we look not through such a hierarchical lens through the world anymore, and that we start to listen to people. And so if I work in a team, driven by green values, everybody's opinion is heard, which is a quality. It becomes a pitfall if we no longer make a difference between the competence of things or not. If we're building a bridge, right, and the structural engineer tells us, it has to be this way. We have to use model A here because that's structurally sound. Model B is not so sound, right? And somebody else that knows nothing about structural engineering says, well, yeah, but I like model B better, and so on. And who are you going to listen to? Which bridge are you going to trust to cross, right? And of course, many things in life aren't so black and white as building a bridge, right? But still, what I see a lot is that what I've seen happening a lot over the last years is that people started to give opinions about things that had absolutely no idea about. We had Douze Kroes in the Netherlands, who was she's a model and an influencer, and she wrote on her Facebook page at one stage, well, I've did many hours of research now, and I've come to the conclusion that this whole COVID thing is a hoax. And I think she's done like 10 hours of research, and she has this big follower. She influenced a lot of people with that. But she wasn't alone. There's many people out there that thought they were, specialists in that. But it's not only there. We in the Integral Global Group, which is around Ken Wilber, we've been having these discussions around what's happening in Ukraine. And there's some people there, they actually write articles for some obscure internet sites about Ukraine, but they have no idea. They've never been to Ukraine. They've never been to Russia. They have no idea about the history of Europe and so on. They know a lot of data points, but they have no idea about the whole, they haven't even been there, right? And they actually write articles, criticizing people like Timothy Snyder, who is one of the world's leading experts when it comes to Eastern Europe, Ukraine, Russia, and who has traveled many times there. Now, I'm not saying that, we shouldn't be critical towards experts, but we should distinguish between things. And from the green perspective, we have this tendency to if we really go into the extreme here, to think that we know better than the experts. This poster you see here was in my childhood bedroom, or my teenage bedroom, when I was 15, 16, 17 years old. So the context was I was living in the Netherlands, in an environment where there's a lot of strong development of green. We lived in the Cold War. So the Cold War wasn't hot, right? Except for a number of incidents in Eastern Europe, the Cold War was a standoff. And from that perspective, I was a convicted pacifist. I voted for the Pacifist Party. The Vietnam War had finished, and we'd seen the disaster there. So there was all these. I read a lot about Cambodia. So I really believed in solving conflicts in a peaceful way, and within my life conditions, I could afford that view. Because there was no war going on. I didn't have to defend my home. There was nothing happening there. Right. But life conditions change, right? And I mean, this is one of these ways that we justify pacifism. We say war is when old men send young men to die for their cause. Quite a few wars are happening that way. Totally right. But I also grew up in the Netherlands, where my grandparents had fought against the Nazis and against the prosecution of the Jews. That was behind us. That's why I was able to live the way I was. But if we go too much into these green values, we start to project our green life conditions onto the rest of the world, and any military operation is seen as bad, even if it is to prevent the women and children in Ukraine from dying at the hands of Russian soldiers, because that's the factual situation there. I'm not talking about just the war situation. I'm also talking about the occupied areas, right? The Russians are very violent towards the Ukrainians. That's why they don't want to live under Russian rule also. So then, from this pacifist perspective, I become against arming Ukraine. But if you look at the life conditions in Ukraine, it's very different. It's a country that is a struggling democracy, but they've chosen democracy. I mean, that's not perfect, but it's been building in the last few decades. So it's actually a very young democracy, and they're being attacked by a totalitarian regime that is very violent towards them. I don't think that in such life conditions I could afford my pacifist view anymore. Right? And this is something that had to come to me in the last 10 years, I would say. I don't know exactly when the big change was. But if I look at the situation now, I think, well, pacifism is great in certain circumstances. Right? But we have to adjust ourselves to the life conditions. And if somebody threatens to rape my daughter, I will protect them. And if I need force for that, I will do that. And I think it's really important to realize that we can even do that from green values. Right? Because if I want harmony in my life and somebody comes in and prevents that harmony, I can use force to stop them. And there's a little thing where I like to talk about the Nobel Peace Prize, which has been given to Ukraine, to a resistance group in Ukraine, Russia, and Belarus. Right now, I'm very sure that the objective from the Nobel Peace Prize Committee, which is generally driven by much green values, is an attempt to create peace. Wouldn't it be great if they can live in peace together? Right? But if I look at what response comes from Ukraine, it's not so harmonious. Great choice, somebody said. Bad combination, wrong year. Zelensky's office was a little bit more to the point. He said the Nobel Committee had an interesting understanding of the word peace. If the representatives of two countries that attacked a third one receives the Nobel Peace Prize. Neither Russian nor Belarusian organizations were able to organize resistance to the war. So I'm sure that some of you may not agree with me on this, but I really invite you to start thinking how this intervention from the Nobel Peace Prize Committee, how that was received by the Ukrainians in a life conditions and where they're actually fighting for their freedom, they're fighting for their livelihood, right? And if you look at the text that they gave with that Nobel Peace Prize, they talk about fraternity between nations. So there's actually an attempt to sort of create a brotherhood there, right? But there is no brotherhood at the moment. And it's actually in line with Putin's propaganda, in which he actually tries to deny the existence of Ukraine. The war is about the right of each of these countries to be independent and to be a sovereign country. That's not a time to focus on brotherhood. That's a time to focus on saying, you're Belarusian, you're Ukrainian, you're Russian. Right? And then in fact that the resistance in Russia and Belarus, however brave the people are there, is not really playing a role in any of this. They're not doing anything at the moment that has a substantial contribution to stopping the war in Ukraine. And I'm not saying they're not brave people, right? And I'm not saying that they don't deserve a Nobel Peace Prize. That's what this guy says. It's a great choice. It's just a bad combination and it's the wrong year to do it this way. But this is what our green thinking creates. If we don't take into account the life conditions of the situation that we are dealing with. Right. Okay. So there's so much to talk about here. I'm going to speed up a little bit this last part because I also want to honor the time set that we set. Another green ID, you could say, is everything is connected, right? When we go to spiritual retreats, we often have these experiences of oneness in which we can see, we can experience how everything in life is connected. I think most of us must have had there's these moments in which you could experience that. And if you meditate a lot, you go to these spiritual retreats, they often give you these great experiences like that. The thing is that we should leave that as an experience. And when we go back to our normal life, we should realize that things also happen independently. But if we go too much into this green wave of experiencing this oneness, one of the pitfalls is that we start connecting things that are not connected. All of a sudden, the COVID virus was created in a laboratory in Ukraine, and that was connected to the cabal So what's happening from this green thinking is that without doing proper research, we start to connect things because they make sense to us. And a lot of these other aspects I talked about, they run parallel to that and they lead to that, right? And what we see happening a lot in people that are giving opinions on the internet is they connect dots that are not connected, right? So the dots are okay, the data points they see are okay. It's true that there's something wrong with the media and the rest. It's true that the governments are influenced too much by the corporations. But then to create a story that's all connected and all of a sudden it becomes one group of people that rules everything, that would require a lot more proof to be true, right? And then we of course we come to the conspiracy theories that are, and again, I mean, there's things in this world that we don't know about, and then we find out about it, and before we find out about it, it's a conspiracy, right? But lately we've seen an enormous increase of stories that invariably lead to a very small group of people controlling the whole world in all sorts of different ways. And again, it happens a lot. A lot of these things I mentioned, they come together in creating these conspiracy stories. It's like connecting dots that are not connected. So it's like the story, there's too much commerce in medicine, in the pharmaceutical industry. It's clearly there's scandals, Then Bill Gates invests in that industry. Then we read a story that Bill Gates wants to use chips in Africa, where there's little things under the skin that can only be read if you put something on it, like the ones you have in your cat. And the reason why he ever suggested that is because in some of these African countries, they don't have central administration systems that can register who has been vaccinated and who's been ill. So it's just a practical solution there. But all these things start to get connected, and all of a sudden, Bill Gates is going to implant a chip in all of us that is using 5G to communicate things to the cabal that are a central group, right? I mean, we can laugh about it, but there's people that seriously believe in this, and it's of course, I can have any different value system. When I'm driven from a different value system, I can still believe in this. But we can see that from a green perspective, the way that from a green value system that opens me up for these conspiracy theories is the fact that I've removed myself from the orange data, that I've connect everything, some of these things I've mentioned. And an important other part of that is that the world is so much in dissonance. I want to create harmony in that. I'm scared of what's happening in that world. And one way to deal with that is if I could only do something about this small group of people that control everything. So it actually gives me a false sense of control. It's a psychological mechanism that's happening there. Rather than admit that we're in a mess and that I'm actually part of that mess, and that things that I do actually add to the mess that we're all in. And it's not just a small group of bad people, but it's all of us, and it's quite a mess that we're in. If you want to let that in, and the fact that a lot of the solutions we don't have, that's a scary thing to see. But if I create these conspiracy stories, it at least gives me the idea that I can control things a little bit more. And don't forget that they pay, right? Don't forget that. I mean, I as a somebody on the internet may believe in it, but somebody on the internet there is earning a lot of money by setting up the sites that I like to read the conspiracy stories on. And everywhere I've looked a little bit into it in the Netherlands, all these people that what is it? WorldViews Cafe, or what is it? There are all these organizations. Willem Engel is one of the Dutch people. They actually, most of them actually earn their money. There's a group of people that earn their money with all this, right? Which is a different dynamic again. And it eventually leads, and I'll leave this to be my last slide. It eventually leads to the marriage between alt-right and the yoga scene. So if you wonder why some of the people we went to yoga retreats with are walking almost hand in hand with Nazis in protests, or the people that I used to spend time with in the spiritual retreats, quite a few of them from the Netherlands now vote for Thierry Baudet, which I could have never have imagined. But you see that there's a number of shared themes that they have, right? They share this idea about freedom, the anti-authoritarian system. They're anti-establishments. They believe in the conspiracy theories. But it's important to realize that people believe in this from different perspectives. If I'm a Thierry Baudet and I'm driven from red values, which I think he is probably his main operating system, the world is a jungle in which I have to fight for my survival, my power, and there's probably a lot of ego in there as well. Same with Trump and a lot of the Trump supporters and supporters of Baudet. On the other hand, we see, the New Age gurus, the Vrouwen voor Vrijheid, which is a Women for Freedom in the Netherlands, Russell Brand. These are people that actually seek personal harmony, see themselves at the center of the universe. They believe in the same theories. They come together, and actually the people that run Vrouwen for Vrijheid, the Women for Freedom, they vote for Baudet, but they'll do it from a different worldview. So there's different underlying memes there. And this is really the last slide. And I want to invite you to back to the integral perspective, where we see that where we can still distinguish, where we don't see the world as one big bad mess run by a small group of people, but where we start to understand that the geopolitics in this world is run by very different governments. Some are struggling orange democracies, some are red dictatorships, and they're actually quite different. They're not the same flavors. Okay. There's so much more to say, but I'm going to stop here.
Okay, Auke, thank you so far for sharing your research and also your personal journey, which reflected in your presentation. So I would like to invite you for some minutes to share what touched you. We are not going into discussion or debate, but just share what touches you about Auke's presentations, and maybe you have a clarifying question before we go afterwards in small groups. Now, if you want to share what touches you, please raise your hand. Yeah, Yuri, please.
Yeah, I'm just curious, like sometimes you said maybe you meant like unhealthy green, but I'm not too sure about it. That green dominant people can feel like they are the center of the universe. But on the other hand, it's also the value system focused on group cohesion. So maybe you can elaborate a little bit on that.
Okay. So what I see happening, what I've seen happening there is that you see the key of green is to create harmony. And if I find that with the group, then then it's group oriented. But if I don't find it and I get under pressure, then it actually can become very narcissistic. And I mean, my wife used to be the organizer of one of these retreats that I went to a lot. And the amount of people that needed specific rooms, the more people dug into the material of searching for themselves, the more they saw what traumas they had. And the more they were in need to have, this specific room, not with that person, that food. And I mean, for the kitchen, it was impossible to cook for the demands of these 100 people that went to that retreat, because they were, and to me, that goes into narcissism. Then we're focused on our personal harmony. We're no longer focused on the good of the whole. And that's a pitfall of green. That can be very strong, like the money example also. And it's actually all, from spiral dynamics, it's a misunderstanding a lot, because green is often seen as being, doing great good, and they do. There's a positive side to that. But this is the pitfall that we've seen in, and I don't think that those people are necessarily falling back to rec values, because they still talk about the world from this green worldview, but they fall into these pitfalls.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you. Are there other reactions?
Mark,
what resonates to you? Yes.
Yes, I was very, taken aback in a way from how you described the Nobel Peace Prize. I literally have not looked at it that way. It was quite confronting, and I really felt almost physically to stretch my green mindset about it. But that's a good thing, and they got the attention or the acknowledgement. I was really struggling, and finally I got it. But at first I just thought, no, Auke, you got this one wrong. Yeah, that's very interesting. I wonder if more people had that experience.
Yeah, kind of. Yes,
Yeah,
kind of the same.
yeah, interesting.
I didn't saw it like that, and it was a new view for me and a very good one. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay, we go to Mark.
Yeah, thanks, Auke. Very, very inspiring, a lot of recognition. There was something which I got an irritation, and perhaps you can clarify it. What is the distinction between the green connecting the dots which are not connected and the value system of that everything is connected, which it comes from a more yellow perspective, like Charles Eisenstein, who I am a great fan of, describes that as a different mindset than the mindset of separation. So what is the difference between what you explained on the green from the green value system and for example what Charles Eisenstein represents?
Okay, so it's from a yellow point of view, we understand that the world is an interconnected system. But we also understand that there is a whole logic in the way that it's connected, right? And so we look for the connections. We look on where that is. And we understand that we, as the Netherlands, cannot solve the climate crisis by ourselves because we're connected to that whole world. But that doesn't mean that any two incidents are taken in the world and they're happening at the same time, that then necessarily there's a causality between them, right? But that's what's happening, you know. So you can almost, I mean, it's just make it. It doesn't mean that we can make up any story without doing proper research to see if it's true or not. If you look at science, if you conduct science, you know there's a difference between correlation and causation, right? If you do a statistical analysis, you may find that in countries with lots of guns, there's also lots of rabbits, right? But those two facts may be totally unrelated. You need to do further research to find out if they're actually related or not. And that's the part that green leaves out. And that's where it then becomes I mean, these conspiracy stories, they are just, things are grouped from a worldview. They're not grouped because of research. No, they're not. There's no research behind any of these like connections between Bill Gates, 5G, and chips. I actually looked into that. For instance, this chips and Bill Gates story. Then I found out what Bill Gates was doing with chips. Right? I know from a technical point of view that you can't inject with a normal vaccine that we get a chip. So that's the sort of scientific knowledge I had. And then I looked to it, and then I see how they connect these stories. And it's because I've looked through so many of these made-up stories, and they're all sort of take a piece of data there, piece of paper there, and they're connected, but it's not true. And it's a very different thing from what you're pointing at, where we understand that there is relationships between things. I'm not doubting that. I'm just saying it's like, you know, when we work with power dynamics in organizations, we start to look at the system, but we also start to look at the relationships and investigate that before we draw conclusions. And that's not what's happening.
Okay, there was also Saskia. You want to?
Oh, it's me.
Thank you. Unfortunately, I'm called away. I had a prior commitment. So I'm going to leave you. But what I wanted to say is that I thank you for the talk, Auke. Very interesting. I must say, I see a lot of people being in conspiracy. I was a political activist most of my life. Spiritual practice is totally crucial and central to me. And what you're saying about the shadow of green, it's very much alive inside myself. So not that I agreed with everything, but yeah, it's enriching my perspective, and I will look further in it. And Leida, I hope so much that I can see the rest of the recording, if that's possible. My apologies that I have to go. I wish you all well.
Okay, thank you, and bye-bye. We have 2 hands, and after that we go in the breakout groups. First Rasa and afterwards Xenia.
Hi everyone. Okay, quickly, I just wanted to share one of my encounters with a very green group, and this was the first day that the war started. So I'm from Lithuania, right? So the plan was initially, right, for Russia to take over Ukraine in 3 days, and then who knows, right? Because we used to have all these threats all the time that, okay, you'll be next, etc. So it was getting real, and you get really, really angry, and you get really, really frustrated. And then I remember I was just sharing it with it was a WhatsApp group. And what was interesting is how I feel that people are so uncomfortable with anger and they try to convert you right away back into love, even if it's fierce love, whatever is the love. Anger is just a bad word. Just don't say it. It's wrong in some way. But for me, it was just like a very healthy emotion that I had to sit with it for a few days, and of course it subsides, etc. But when people just started sending me like the maps with the wars are happening, where the wars are happening in the world, and why on earth are you kind of with this message? Why are you caring only about the war in Ukraine? Why you don't care about the war in Syria, etc. This was very, very,
Okay, thank you.
People are very extremely uncomfortable, and I'm kind of thinking, if you cannot sit with that discomfort, maybe this is as well kind of, it prevents us to actually shift into maybe more yellow perspectives. Yeah. That's it.
Okay, then Kenya, you raised also your hand.
Yes. So as far as I remember, sorry. Okay, you had one slide where you compared red and orange, if I remember correctly. And just for my own understanding, I was wondering, how you came to put up specifically those 2 memes, because I was thinking there's blue in between, and kind of, do you mean that if orange starts kind of crumbling, it kind of goes back or regresses, but jumps over blue and goes straight to red? Would be great to know how you meant that.
Okay, I'm not sure which slide it is. Maybe where I said that that the red greed is using the neoliberalism.
I think that one, yeah.
Because neoliberalism is cutting out the blue in society. It's cutting out the rules and regulations because it wants freedom to do trading, freedom to do anything commercial, and it also cuts out because what people think of like social care in Northern Europe as being a green thing, and there's a lot of green in it, but a lot of it developed from blue social values. And when you take that layer out of society, and you like in the UK, where they've sort of basically crumbled the power of the unions, you take the social layer out of society, and you get this really a lot of space for red and for orange, basically. Yeah.